Okay, so part two. So we left off with basically the 50s and kind of the beginning of the 60s. So we're going to pick up with JFK's assassination. So that was in 1963. So you got to think the world or the US is already going through this whole Cold War thing, right? Like we've already been involved in the Korean War. We are getting involved in the Vietnam War. So you have to think about the fact that we're already, to think about the 50s and the 60s is there are so many things that are happening at the same time. So one of those things was the Kennedy assassination. So basically, with that, we just talk about the effects of it. So we don't go into any of the conspiracy theories or anything like that, although they are pretty interesting if you want to go look at them. But some of the effects of this assassination, first of all, it showed Americans the stability of our government. Because again, like I said, we're going through all of this craziness with the Cold War, really tense time for America. And then our president gets assassinated, and the government just keeps on keeping on. I mean, they just keep on trucking. And his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, steps up and takes office. And so it just keeps rolling along. And so the new president, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, has the power after this to push his ideas through Congress. And we're going to see what some of those are in the next slide. And also, we get the 25th Amendment. So that's the one that officially sets up who becomes president if the president is killed or dies or whatever. So those are some of your effects of the Kennedy assassination. Also, during the 50s and 60s, we have the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is focusing on equality for specifically Blacks, focusing on equality of the races, basically. And so in 1954, we get the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. And that's the one that says that separate but equal is no longer going to be okay in schools, in public schools. So before, with Plessy versus Ferguson, that Supreme Court case, they said, separate but equal, totally fine. But then Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, they come back and they kind of go against that. And they say, no, that's not okay, because the equal part of it really isn't equal. And so they start to integrate the schools. And then we have the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963. You've probably heard clips of that speech or probably seen parts of it. Really, really impactful. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people gathering there to hear that speech. And so then in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson is able to sign off on the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. So this is going to officially end segregation in public places. So we're not going to have, the colored theater and the white theater, the colored water fountain and the white water fountain. We're not going to do that anymore after this. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests to vote. And it said, because what they were trying to do in the South is people were still trying to get around some of these things. And so it makes it so that the federal government steps in and oversees some of those elections in the southern states to prevent some of this from happening. So the other thing that we talk about in the 60s is TV. So TV becomes really popular in the 60s. It was invented before the 60s, but it becomes like in every household, basically, in the 60s. And it makes a lot of changes. There are a lot of things that it does that you might not think about. So first of all, you have the election of 1960. That's the first televised presidential debates. So that was between Nixon and JFK. And basically, JFK comes off as this like cool, young, put together, stylish guy. Nixon was sick or just getting over being sick. So he was like, he didn't look well. He looked tired. He looked old. So basically, just proves that from this point on, image is going to matter. And it also helped gain support for the civil rights movement because in the South, some of these protests and things that were taking place, the protesters were peacefully protesting, meaning that they were not engaging in any type of violence, but they were being responded to with violence. So you can see here in this picture, people being hosed down by a fire hose, which cannot feel good, and being attacked by police dogs and beaten and all of these things for these protests. And so people are going to start seeing that on TV, and they're going to start to become outraged at this. Like, why is this happening? And it gains support for the civil rights movement. Remember with the launch of Sputnik, we're going to start this big space race, which is where basically we see that the Soviet Union has something in space. So we realize, crap, we need to get into space now. So they broadcast the moon landing, and that's going to help us feel like the space race is kind of symbolically over. So that was a big impact. And then also you've got TV coverage of the Vietnam War. So this is the first war that we're able to see firsthand. They called it the living room war, because you had actual reporters like on the front lines with the soldiers. And that is going to turn public opinion even more against the war. Because you just have to think, imagine seeing these super violent, grisly images. You're seeing soldiers that are hurt and wounded. And just imagine if you see that on TV and that soldier happens to be your brother or, your friend or who, So people started to see this and it lost support for the war. And so people are upset about it and saying, we're going to start to see, especially in the late 60s and 70s, we're going to start to see a lot of protest against the Vietnam War. They don't want to be in it. So then 1968 was just a crazy year. Maybe like 2020. So 1968, a lot of stuff happened. So in January, we have the beginning of what we call the Tet Offensive. So that's over in the Vietnam War. Basically, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, which was kind of like the guerrilla group of like guerrilla war fighters in Vietnam, they launched this like all-out attack on all of our military bases in South Vietnam. And it just goes to show people, like the president had just said, hey, the Vietnam War is going great and, everything's fine. And that really showed us that it was not. We were nowhere close to being out of that war. We were nowhere close to winning. So that was very upsetting to a lot of people. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, which is going to set off riots in over 100 cities. So you got to think that's basically like 2 major cities per state that are having these massive riots. Then in June, Robert F. Kennedy, who was JFK's brother, who was running for president, he's assassinated while on the campaign trail. And so then at the Democratic National Convention, when they're trying to nominate another candidate because Robert F. Kennedy was shot, there's a bunch of protest against the against the Vietnam War. I almost said Civil War. So against the Vietnam War, there's a whole bunch of protest. And what ends up happening is the police end up like attacking these protesters, and it turns really, really violent, and you get this like massive riot at the Democratic National Convention, which of course is then broadcast all over TV. And so all of these things happened in 1968. So it just really seemed like craziness. I mean, it just seemed like the world was going bonkers. So I'm going to stop there, and I will continue on part 3.